and welcome to this next video from our History International Film Festival Austria. I'm very happy to have the director of the film Borderland Memories with me today. And yeah, my first question would be if you would be so kind to introduce yourself and your film and why you chose to work on this topic.
Okay, my name is Edie Steiner. I'm in Toronto, Canada. My film is Borderland Memories. It's a feature documentary, and I'm actually an immigrant to Canada as a small child. I was born in Germany, and the film is kind of a way that I could explore my personal relationship to having been born German in the years after the war and all those events, but having been a child later in school in Canada, I often dealt with a lot of anxiety around having been born German, coming from Germany, a lot of guilt around the Holocaust. It's kind of a post-Holocaust identity that I assumed. And it kind of haunted me for a long time. I made another shorter film about it back about more than 20 years ago before that, called Places to Stay. And that was about discovering my Canadian identity through the landscape. And so this film was also motivated by kind of unfinished reflections on that identity, that it still would haunt me if I'd meet a Jewish person at a party and they may question me in some way that would make me feel uncomfortable. So I felt I had to kind of get more involved with those themes. As well, my father was from Lower Silesia, which is now Poland, and he left, he was still quite young, and they had to Silesia. All the Germans were expelled, and this was a story I wasn't that aware of, and I began to look into it mostly through historians that had written about it, but there wasn't a lot of public knowledge around the theme of the post-war forced migrations. And of course, there's about 10 million Germans that were evicted from Silesia, and they were replaced by Polish settlers who also had to leave their homeland further east and resettle Silesia. So I felt it was a really interesting story to explore. And I actually met a German artist who was here on a residency, and he told me that this whole narrative is almost like a taboo subject in Germany. And there was some discomfort about me wanting to explore this story. I've discovered it wasn't heavily documented. I did find photographs that I used in the film of the migrations that I mostly found in the archive in Berlin, the German Historical Museum, the Deutsche Historische Museum. And that was great to have those images. And, I have a number of textbooks written by scholars that I delved into to sort of background myself. But also I did go to the village of my ancestors, and I found the house built by my greats. And I also discovered I had a Jewish lineage myself through my father's line, through a great-great-grandmother who had married a German. There was some confusion. There was one of them was a son of a German woman who was unmarried, so we don't really know her identity. So I started, compositing all these different stories, and I tend to work very intuitively, and I often start with visual images, with landscape, with just the impressions that arise from immersing oneself in a particular site. And then from there, I will build the narrative. So that's how I kind of, once I got over to Silesia, I saw the house, I found it, and I also connected with a Polish anthropologist from a university in Poland, Poznan University. And she was very helpful, especially in the village where no one spoke English or German. She's in the film, Agata Stanis. She actually did some of the audio recording. The very first, she interviewed me first, and then I used that interview. We shared it as intellectual knowledge and intellectual property because we were both doing research. And that led later to her and her colleague bringing their students to the village to do field work, field research, because a lot of them were descendants now of Polish settlers, right? Because they were so much younger, they're students in their early 20s. This was in 2018 that we did that trip. So it was kind of a collage of various stories and images that built the film.
Very interesting to hear. It sounds like a lot of work and a lot of time you spent to work on this film. How long did it take for you? Is it possible to say when you started with the research?
I would say the real start was 2015 when I went to Lower Silesia for the first time, to Poland for the first time. And I had met Agata online. Actually, another artist who had lived in Wrocław, he said, you should look her up. And I looked her up and we connected, and her being a cultural anthropologist, she was very interested in what I was doing. So we agreed to meet and to go to the archive together, but nothing really came of that, going to the archive. And when she and I went to the village, we didn't find the house, but the next day I went back by myself, and I just somehow serendipitously met this guy who I showed the picture, and he said, I know that house, I'm going to take you there. Because it was a long village, like a couple of kilometers through a main road. And once I found it, I felt I had an anchor. And then I reconnected with Agata and Lucas, her colleague, who was also in the film and as mentioned. And we decided we're going to do something together. So that was the trip that happened in 2018. Meanwhile, and in 2017, I went back to the village with my cousin, who had been born there in the 1950s, because my grandfather was kept there to work for the Soviets, because he had certain skills, because they emptied all of Silesia, and so the workforce was gone, and there were they had to keep some German people behind who knew how to run things. So they were my grandparents were still there. And my cousin was born of one of their children, my aunt. And nobody really, she never wanted to go back. She didn't hear very happy stories. And I convinced her to go with me. And then I rented a car and I drove from Germany because I could rent a car easier. Germany with, minimal German that I speak. And so, so there are these different stories, and there was also applying for funding, which didn't always come through, and then you reapply, and then it does happen. And then by the time I was ready to do post-production, we were in the pandemic, and so all of that happened online, and it was slower. I started working with an editor. I do my own editing up to a certain point, but I felt I needed an outside editor to help me. With this project, because it was bigger and it was so personal, and there were sort of technical things that I wanted to do that that an editor would have more skill than me to create. And then of course the music was original music with a composer I've worked with before in the past. So so all those things took time. And then once in 2020, we were here in lockdown. I was actually teaching in a college, a media art program at that time, and we all had to go online. And so it was all this sorting out of technology and how to best work, you know, at distance where you couldn't sit together in the editing room anymore.
Yeah.
That made that drew that out a little more slowly. And I guess just the revision, the narration was sort of filling in the gaps. And then actually, I was going to make it very much about landscape. You see, there's a lot of images in the film where I'm walking and talking, but we're in a landscape, but you hear our conversation. It was post-recorded. And an editor friend of mine convinced me that I needed some talking heads. I might not have done it, but I had done, you know, in the village, I interviewed one of the people who now occupies one of the apartments in the house. And then I decided to go to some some sort of more academic voices to talk about the migration, not so much, a little bit, but East German history, sort of different sort of expert voices to kind of fill in some of the research that I had done that I didn't want to just be citing. It was too much information. And of course, you've seen the film, so you know Michaela Pohl, the German woman who is a professor of history at Vassar College in the US. I discovered her online through a paper I read. And she's also a sort of outsider artist. She nothing to do so much with her job as a professor, but as an independent. She does these kind of graphic novel, kind of very political cartoons and stories. So I ended up interviewing her a couple of times. And of course, it was easy for me because I could fly down to New York in 2 hours rather than having to go overseas. And she had that personal history of having grown up in Germany, and she was able to help me differentiate what it was like to be an immigrant as a child and take on that identity compared to someone who grew up in Germany at the time she did, which I think she was in high school in the 70s and 80s maybe, and then she immigrated to the US. So there are all these different perspectives, and the other professor, who's an East German expert, also had a mixed identity. One parent, you know, half German, half Canadian, and her voice is interesting because she compares the importance of the history to teaching her children, not just students, but you know, the kids as well, that they shouldn't assume the guilt of that, but they should be aware of the politics around it. So there are all these different kind of voices that intersect with my own voice.
Yeah, and it is also interesting to see when not only that it is a very emotional topic for you, but also that you decided then to discuss different aspects of borders. I would say that's how I felt when I saw the film. That it's not only the border between two countries, but borders in a different way. Were you also trying to work on this topic of borderlands? How did this come?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because some people that I interviewed talk about borders too, and the German woman Michaela, Professor Pohl, she commented that she on the word homeland and the kind of baggage that a word like homeland carries, and it means so many different things to different cultures as well. But in Germany, the idea of homeland was, you know, defended and bordered. And of course, through history, the idea of the border has changed, and the border is also a state of mind, perhaps, that we can't enter a certain sphere, that we can't talk about things, that the silencing of the history, which is part of the German identity too, that there were certain subjects that weren't necessarily safe talk about my own parents' silence, and other people's talked about their parents, the difficulty in framing that particular history of German guilt and German identity after the war, and how that has shifted historically in recent years with Germany's role in taking on migrants, and it was almost like a kind of atonement for the past. And one of the people I interviewed, the same woman, Professor Paul, she often talked about how it was safer to discuss these things when they were back, which was back in Wrocław, which was formerly Breslau, when her mother left, and somehow she couldn't talk about it in certain environments were more conducive to being more open in these discussions. And I guess for me, the border, the idea of mixing these identities of, I'm a Canadian, but I also felt strongly my German identity. And the idea that I couldn't claim it was also problematic. And I had to trouble that in a way, because, why should I not be able to claim German identity when it's much more complex than what happened during my grandparents' time and when my parents were children. There's this whole prior history to Germany, and the idea that I had a Jewish ancestral line coming from that earlier history. So I was trying to pull these threads together in my sort of overarching narrative, and the idea of, maybe of crossing a border, that I had to kind of come to terms with this psychological state that I was carrying within myself, that I had to maybe come to terms with accepting whatever happened in my life, my parents' life. I couldn't change. I tried to interview my mother. She's in it a little bit, but her memory isn't that good anymore. And she had some traumas, childhood trauma as well, around the memories of her parents. And her father had died very young during the war. He was only 40 or 41, and she was just a kid. So trying to, get at her memories without causing further pain to her, that I would, make her remember things that were traumatic because they related to her childhood. And her own sense of having been an immigrant as a young woman in her 20s, and being, often there were some events that happened to her from neighbors, and, it wasn't a very nice time to be German, to be an immigrant in the 50s, when so many European immigrants came on various labor programs to North America, Canada, and in the US as well, from all the many European countries, not just Germany, Italy, and it was kind of a labor force, government subsidized through Canada. I can only speak for the Canadian part of it. I don't quite know what happened in American history. So there are all these kind of blended histories and ideas of difference and social difference, and also the class difference too, because most of the people who came were working class, unless they were experts in a particular area where their expertise was needed. So that again was a different level of migration, different to it was not a forced migration, but it was indentured labor programs at that time, post-war years, 50s and 60s.
Yeah, these are huge topics involved, and I think we could talk for hours. I really hope that for the audience, it will be it is as helpful as it is for me to know a little bit more about your reasons behind why you made this film, and thank you very much for these very personal insights, and yeah. I wish you all the best for this film, for also other festivals, and for your further projects. Is it a historical related film you're looking forward to again, or is it what can we expect from you?
I'm not quite sure in terms of narrative. I've recently gone back to making very short experimental films, which have been getting in some festivals, and that's kind of my history as a filmmaker. I started in the 1980s as an experimental filmmaker, often doing live music with film projections, working in Super 8 and then in 16 millimeter. And I ended up making a few other documentaries, mostly about Canadian subjects, environmental subjects particularly. I was doing a PhD in environmental studies, and so I made environmental films as part of that process, and just shortly after. And this is Borderland Memories is a kind of environmental film because it explores, social, political, cultural environments, and that was my stream of study was environment and culture. So this was kind of a fitting, project to make after I finished my doctorate. But I did a lot of work around eco-poetry as well. So I'm kind of doing these ecologically poetic, really short experimental films, partly because I can do them now without having to raise funding as well. So I'm just working on a few pieces like that at the moment, a collection of shorts.
All right. Okay. Wow. Brilliant. Okay. So in that case, yeah, all the best for your projects. It sounds very interesting.
The project actually is available as well online. I know the festival is going to be online. Okay. But some of my colleagues at a university in Canada, in Northern Canada, Lakehead University, they've started a channel online called Research TV. Research TV. So through your university, your scholarly connections, you could get access to that. Okay. And this film, I've placed it with them. They run a festival in the north, and I'm always interested in festivals that are either more alternative or that take place in locations that are not, Toronto, Berlin, New York, that are, either in different communities that may not have access to a festival. So, so now, of course, a lot of this is available online. So Research TV is one place you may want to discover or even put films that you want to continue, scholarly venue windows for.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice. All right.
Thank you for
that's it for now.
Yeah.